Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, it is I am the one and only Mexi here once again, and I am back for the likes of the Mexi Toys videos. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back for some more of Let's Play of Sonic the Hedgehog, or most people call it Sonic the Hedgehog 2006, for the Xbox 360/PlayStation 3. And believe it or not, this is actually going to be the final time we're going to be able to be saying this throughout the majority of this playthrough. But anyway, so last time we've essentially did manage able to still continue playing through very hard mode as Shadow, by not only we did somehow manage able to went into not only one stage but 3 stages, which there are Crisis City, Flame Core, and finally Radical Train. With some mixed results, well, usually the only time exception being is of course both Crisis City and Flame Core, because surprisingly enough, we actually did manage able to achieve a glorious S rank when it comes to 2 of those stages in particular, except one which appears to be Radical Train. Well, this is mainly because I did somehow messed up in during the forms of that particular second segment while you're trying to able to do some bit of damage to Dr. Eggman's train. But aside from those side of things though, I think we actually did that particular run okay enough as it is, despite the fact that, well, so far so good anyway, in regards to the forms of certain ranks that we somehow obtained. Like, for instance, is about the fact that so far, in Shadow's playthrough in very hard mode, that, basically though, is about the fact that we somehow achieved 3 S ranks so far, and 2 B ranks so far. So generally speaking though, that's actually quite a good run, despite the fact that there might be a couple of times about the fact that we had to able to try to deal with some frustration from time to time, but that's besides the point. So today, ladies and gentlemen, we're about to present to you with the forms of the absolute true finale of our Let's Play of Sonic the Hedgehog 2006, especially notable because today we're about to finish up the forms of every single DLC, not just the entire DLC, but the entirety of the very hard mode playthrough. So no matter what though, is about the fact that something tells me is about the fact that we can now able to actually just to go ahead and deal with the final 3 stages in Shadow's playthrough in Journey Evolves within very hard mode, which there are Aquatic Base, Wave Ocean, and finally Dusty Desert. So because of that though, hopefully though these couple of stages won't give me that much trouble or anything. So again, I will try my best able to actually get ourselves a pretty good rank, all things considered. Well, don't get your hopes up at this point just yet, because obviously no matter what though, now for the most part it's about the fact that when it comes to those 2 stages in particular, which there are Aquatic Base alongside with the forms of Wave Ocean, on very hard mode, I'm quite surprised about the fact that both of those stages in particular doesn't take me that long to complete. Like, it was surprisingly really short compared to the forms of how it does it on the majority of the stages so far during the forms of in very hard mode in Shadow's run. So relatively speaking, I was about the fact that for the most part, but that Aquatic Base is self-explanatory for the most part, except the fact that unlike in Journey Forms of in normal mode, alongside with the forms of hard mode as well, that normally we were supposed to be able to try to play as not only Shadow, but also with Silver as well. That's not the case on very hard mode this time around, because as you probably already expect, that we're going to be keep on playing as not only Rouge, but also with E123 Omega throughout the majority of the difficulty. So no matter what though, yeah, I can totally see why this is totally different compared to the forms of how it does it on not only on normal mode, but also on hard mode as well. And relatively speaking, I was about the fact that the next stage coming up, which appears to be Wave Ocean, that will be the only stage that we're not going to be playing as Rouge or E123 Omega during the forms of very hard mode on that specific stage. So because of that though, and you see what I mean, whenever we just somehow managed able to go into, you know, Aquatic Base for the final time for this Let's Play. So generally speaking, I was about the fact that it's also worth noting for, this will be the final time we're going to be seeing certain vehicles in action, like for instance with the buggy and Yeah, that's all I can really say about that. Now, there's one thing I totally forgot to mention about during the course of that particular portion of Shadow's story in Journey Forms within Sonic the Hedgehog 2006, in regards to the forms of discussing upon the actual vehicles that you can able to actually play around with. Like, I completely forgot to mention about, in Journey Forms within a buggy vehicle, there was actually a method you can able to actually just make that vehicle a lot more faster. Like, for instance, if you try to able to, like, quickly tap the X button, or specifically trying to tap the A button depending on what version of the game you're playing. Like, for instance, if you tap the button twice, that way it should able to give you a bit of a speed. So generally speaking, that'll be pretty useful though, although I rarely used it though, especially noticeable. The only time I did somewhat use it was in Journey Forms within the town missions, when I did manage to play this game on my own time, not only on the PlayStation 3 version, but it's also on the Xbox 360 version as well, for the sake of the forms of getting those specific achievements I want to achieve, and on top of all that stuff though, just trying to complete the insane amount of those town missions, despite the fact there are a grand total of 50 of them. So yeah, that does seem quite a lot, especially noticeable about the fact that despite the fact you have to deal with so many loading screens, by the way, if you really want to get out of your way to able to try to tackle through every single town missions in this game, you know, has to offer. So generally speaking though, I just try to able to say this right about now, that I will still able to skip over the rest of the forms of the town missions, just because, well, technically we've already done some of them. Like, some of them are mandatory in order to able to progress, while some of them are just for optional sake side of things, especially noticeable because, like I've already established that before, that the majority of the town missions, for not only for Shadow, but also with Silver as well, are just entirely pointless, because after all, unlike in Sonic's playthrough, specifically in Sonic's story, that I did somehow manage to able to play around with certain town missions every once in a while, so that way I can able to actually just try to get some more rings every once in a while, just to ensure for the fact I can able to actually get every single upgrades for Sonic, whilst compared to Shadow and Silver though, there is no point able to tackle for them all, unless if you really want to get out of your way to able to fully 100% everything in this game, specifically if you really want to try to get yourselves with a whole bunch of those gold Soleander medals. So as a result, yeah, by all means, you must able to just skip those missions entirely for both Shadow and Silver, which as a result, I've already on about that ever since in Journey Forms have been the majority of this entire Let's Play so far. So anyway, and that basically does it for everything for the sake of the forms of Aquatic Base. Yeah, I was very surprised about the fact that Aquatic Base is really short, because thankfully though, that unlike the forms of how it does it in Sonic's Aquatic Base, alongside with Silver's Aquatic Base, that basically though, we have to force to able to get onto that particular silver metallic ball as a platform in order able to try to navigate through those particular corridors and everything, while trying to avoid the whole bunch of lasers, because, you know, if you dare touch the lasers, then obviously you fall off and die. Whilst Shadow, he's the only one that he somehow ignores the actual silver metallic ball for that particular segment, unless if you really want to get out of your way to able to show off some multiplayer aspects, specifically with not only in tag mode, but also with battle mode as well, that Shadow can technically able to actually experience with the forms of silver metallic ball, and the journey forms of one of those segments in Aquatic Base. But let's face it though, it's about the fact I don't think it's possible we can able to show off multiplayer after all, just because no matter what though, they're just there, and also from what I've heard is incredibly unbalanced, so, which I've already on about that, ever since in Journey Forms of the majority of this game as well, so yeah, you can probably get the idea about that, which I'll get into more details about my true final thoughts of this game, until whenever we get to the final stage in very hard mode as Shadow, because as you can tell, we now ended up in Wave Ocean, and surprisingly enough, Wave Ocean was also very short as well, mainly due to the fact that, obviously if you couldn't tell, we have to force to able to actually catch a ride on not only one, but two vehicle types, which there are Hang Glider, which that will be the final time we're going to be seeing the Hang Glider section, and on top of that, we're able to actually go on to the second section, where, speaking of which though, the first section is nothing right to hum about. It feels practically the exact same, it feels practically the same as the forms of how it does on the normal mode, as well as hard mode. The only time exception to this time around though, if you couldn't tell already, is that the majority of some enemies has been swappable. Like, for instance, it's about the fact that normally on hard mode, as well as normal mode, that basically though is about the fact that you always have to keep on fighting those, not only Iblis monsters, but also with the forms of Mephiles demon monsters as well. Usually for the sake of the forms of not only in Aquatic base, but as well as for that though, with the forms of Wave Ocean, and finally Dusty Desert, because at this point in time, that those enemies has now been swapped over into a bunch of Eggman's robots, just to make things a little bit more challenging, especially noticeable because if you couldn't tell, every time when the Eggman's robots decide to keep on shooting one of those specific vehicles, it could be either be the buggy, or hovercraft, as well as the forms of the hang glider, or anything else like that, it will slowly deplete its health meter for the majority of the vehicles. So because of that though, yeah, there's nothing else I can really say about it. The second segment, in Journey Forms of Wave Ocean, plays a little bit differently compared to the forms of how it does it on normal mode, as well as hard mode, because normally, it does manage to able to give you to take control of the forms of Omega. That's basically though you have to go after Mephiles, whilst later on though you play as Shadow and it does manage to take you into the forms of the open area, whilst usually in the very hard mode it does things completely different, because normally we did somehow manage to able to get onto the hang glider while trying to able to actually go in the reverse version of that particular segment of the Mark Speed section as Sonic. But this time, we're actually going to be going into a completely opposite direction on the second segment, where basically though, if you go onto the second segment right here, then obviously you're able to actually catch a ride on the forms of the motorcycle, and then once you're able to go all the way back, and obviously if you couldn't tell already, rather than just trying to able to go for that little spiral loop-to-loop thing, unlike the forms of how it does it in Sonic's Wave Ocean, well, basically though, we're able to actually launch ourselves thanks to the forms of the dash ramp, and as a result, we have to find a spring, and that way, it should able to take us straight towards the end of the level, despite the fact that you have to work with the actual camera angle. So, yeah, it's a bit interesting, especially noticeable because, well, just like the forms of how it does it for Aquatic base, thankfully that stage is ridiculously short. So much to the point about the fact that there's only like 2 sections, which does manage to take place into this identical location. So, yeah, I fully appreciate about that. And it's also worth noting for is about the fact that I believe Wave Ocean, in very hard mode in Shadow's playthrough, this is the only stage in that particular playthrough that does not give you the ability to able to play as not only Rouge the Bat, but also with E123 Omega as well. So, yeah, that's actually something, I suppose. So, and yeah, that's all I can really say about the forms of Wave Ocean, and in fact, no matter what though, that was the final time we're going to be able to explore into Wave Ocean. And speaking of the final time though, here we go on to the final stage in terms of the forms of the, not only in very hard mode in its entirety, but with Shadow's playthrough as well, also in very hard mode, or anything else like that. So, I already know for a fact it's been about 2 days ago since I actually have last played this game for sure, just because you know how the fact that recently yesterday, that Tiana, she still basically continued playing through Princess Peach Showtime recently. So, yeah, that's always something. So, anyways, as you can see, in Journey Forms of Dusty Desert on very hard mode, that basically in the beginning portion you still need to able to ride on that particular hovercraft as a vehicle, and in fact, no matter what though, this is going to be the final time we're going to be seeing that particular hovercraft in action, because relatively speaking though, I still really despised about the fact that certain vehicles can able to tip over at one point, which has always felt a bit very annoyingly inconsistent, especially noticeable if you, again, if you accidentally get bumped into something, specifically with those pillars you need to go through, and as a result you might end up trying to go into instant death moments for that particular quicksand. So because of that though, at least thankfully though, as I said before, that was the true final time we're going to be interacting with the vehicles. So, and relatively speaking, speaking of going through those little gates, or poles, essentially, that's what makes very hard a little bit interesting for the sake of the forms of the very hard mode version of Dusty Desert, is that potentially speaking, you now need to able to jump over with the hovercraft by simply trying to jump over those spike falls while trying to able to actually go past those specific pole gates. Now, once you're able to go through every single pole gate, if you think you basically know you can able to actually entering the temple portion or the ruins, portion of Dusty Desert, well, as it turns out, you need to dish out as many of those enemies as you could, so generally speaking, that way you can able to progress. So, and this is where the point about the fact that I feel like that very hard mode in Dusty Desert is not only is without doubt is the most frustrating level in the entire game, but with the entire DLC with it as well. But it's also without doubt is the longest stage in terms of the forms of attack, or in some cases act trials kind of stages like this. Especially noticeable because whenever I first played this particular level on the Xbox 360 version back then, my god, this stage is like a marathon of any sort, ranging from killing all sorts of enemies and trying to play as E123 Omega at one point, as well as Rouge the Bat. So generally speaking, that's also going to be the final time we're going to be playing as not only E123 Omega, but also with Rouge the Bat as well. So relatively speaking, it's about the fact that, yeah, then again, we'll explain about the forms of my final thoughts of Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 after so many years since when this game was first came out in 2006 for the Xbox 360 version and 2007 for the PlayStation 3 version. So either way, let's talk about the forms of another topics at this point throughout. That's what appears to be about the fact that, well, today's date, of course, the year is the 19th of April today, in some cases in 2024 today. So generally speaking, is about the fact that until next week, that Knuckles the series on Paramount Plus is going to be releasing next week. So hope you guys may be looking forward to this until next week. Especially noticeable because we were so excited to know of what the actual story is going to lead us to just before when Sonic the Hedgehog 3 the movie is just on the horizon. So relatively speaking, it was about the fact that despite it's going to be a 6-episode event, so I honestly don't mind about it at all, because for what I've heard anyway, each and every single episode in the forms of Knuckles the series on Paramount Plus is going to be roughly about 1 hour for each episode, making a grand total of 6 hours we got able to experience with the Knuckles the series. So I honestly don't mind about it at all. And in fact, no matter what though, it's actually been a very long time since Knuckles received its own thing, since Knuckles Chaotix back in new forms of in 1995 for the miserable add-on for the likes of the Sega Mega Drive 32X, because obviously that add-on was a flop. So because of that though, you know what I mean, with this unnecessary design, and on top of all that stuff though, there's little amount of those titles that could be found for 32X, because I can totally see why about the fact that Sega learned about the fact that just trying to focus on, you know, certain software to be released for the actual Sega Mega Drive / Sega Genesis. You know, kind of like the same thing what they did for the likes of the Mega CD or Sega CD, depending on what region you lived in. So either way, I'm sure it must be something you might able to know about. So anyway, so yeah, let me know in the comments down below for the question of the day. Are you guys looking forward to next week to able to actually watch Knuckles the series? Because obviously, I am sure I am. Especially noticeable because, relatively speaking now, we've only just almost got about, I want to say, about the fact that we've almost now on to 8 months left now until Sonic the Hedgehog 3, the movie, is going to be releasing. So because of that, still I'm very excited for it still, and I'm sure that most die-hard Sonic fans, including myself, are going to be super hyped about it, especially noticeable still that we are very excited to see Shadow the Hedgehog on a big screen, and relatively speaking, we still have no idea of who is going to be voicing Shadow, because generally speaking, it's about the fact that for those of you unaware, that back in about a couple of days ago, that recently CinemaCon has recently did mention Sonic the Hedgehog 3 as the forms of one of those brief teaser information. And as it turns out, no matter what though, it's about the fact that not only does it able to bring not only Sonic, but also with Tails and Knuckles and even Shadow the Hedgehog. And relatively speaking of, what I've heard anyway, that Jim Carrey as Dr. Robotnik, or Eggman if you want to be more precise, that apparently though, Eggman is about to get fatter on the 3rd movie, which as a result, yeah, it's going to be a little bit more interesting, for I've noticed that anyway. Well, mind you about the fact that we were expecting about the fact that the trailer might be up. Well, as it turns out, that's not the case, because obviously though, they just want to keep it as a super top secret, understandably so, because obviously despite the fact that the actual filming of Sonic the Hedgehog 3 has been concluded, but obviously they still need to work on not only maybe the soundtrack, and also say applies with the forms of the composition for the forms of the music or anything else like that, as well as the forms of the voice acting, and on top of all that stuff though, voice casts, as well as the actual dialogue lines, as well as the script, and most importantly is of course visual effects alongside with CGI as well, specifically with the forms of Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles, and as well as Shadow. So generally speaking, it's about the fact that we have to wait for a little long while, especially noticeable about the fact that honestly, I don't mind waiting, especially noticeable because after all, the next film I'm definitely going to be seeing next is of course Inside Out 2, so I'm still basically excited for that, especially noticeable because I'm just so looking forward to see Joy on big screen once again ever since back in 2015. So yeah, I can't even believe it's been almost like 10 years ago since when the original Inside Out did somehow came out, which as a result, until when it gets to the point until 2025, not only we can able to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the original film's release, but also for what I've heard that we're about to able to celebrate the 30th anniversary of one of those short film releases of Wallace and Gromit: A Close Shave, which also means it's going to be the 30th anniversary of the character's introduction of Shaun the Sheep himself, which that was before when Shaun the Sheep did somehow deserves to able to actually have not only the TV series of Shaun the Sheep, but also with 2 movies so far with Shaun the Sheep himself, with the films of the movie came out in 2015, and on top of that with Farmageddon, a Shaun the Sheep movie, in 2019. So yeah, pretty substantial predicaments for the sake of the films of the 30th anniversary coming up for the likes of in 2025. Oh yeah, that could be also applies for the 30th anniversary of not only Toy Story, but also with the films of GoldenEye, and as well as from that, there's also Batman Forever. I think that's what I was going to be thinking about. Well, despite the fact I still have not seen certain Batman films recently, aside from Batman Begins, alongside with the films of The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises, because as far as I'm aware, those particular films are really dang good, at least from my circumstances anyway. So, but anyway, speaking of which though, is about the fact that recently, that Kept King 74, he's now recently finished up everything for his Let's Play of Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix. So, yeah, that's actually pretty cool stuff, especially noticeable he did manage to show off every single aspect about the films of not only for this entire base game of Kingdom Hearts 2, but also with Final Mix content either way. So generally speaking though, suffice to say, I think he was able to deserve a break for experiencing not 1, not 2, but 3 RPG games in a row where it comes to doing Let's Plays and stuff. Like overall, that he did manage to able to play too much of RPGs, which sure, that I don't mind too much, especially noticeable that he plays, without a doubt, is one of the best RPG games ever made, which there are Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, the original GameCube version, as well as Kingdom Hearts 2 Final Mix, as well as the forms of Pokemon Fire Red, or Leaf Green, and you pretty much name the rest of it. So, speaking of Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door though, is that recently I did somehow manage to able to discover there was actually not 1 but 2 brand new images has been revealed for the likes of Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door on Switch. And they are both entirely related to the forms of Chapter 4, by the way, which actually shows us the forms of a, not only the HUD for it, likely also for the sake of the forms of, you know, with the directional pad, that you can able to actually navigate through specific menus with either party, gear, badges, as well as travel log, and all that stuff, which, by the way, the actual font is actually translated into Japanese, by the way. So, relatively speaking, it was about the fact that what I've noticed on the forms of the actual HUD, for the sake of the forms of that particular screenshots, by the way, it does look pretty cool looking. Especially noticeable because, relatively speaking, I was about the fact that I can't even believe by saying this, is about the fact that I'm pretty concerned that we've almost nearly there to that particular game's release of Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door on Switch, but I'm still basically excited for it though, and relatively speaking, I'm sure a lot of people out there are also very excited about this as well. So either way, yeah, pretty cool stuff. So Oh yeah, there's something I completely forgot to mention about. Back in Journey Forms have been around almost 3 years ago. That's what appears to be about the fact that, you guys even remember back in Journey Forms have been 2021? That basically though, I did already tackle through Pac-Man World 3 for the PlayStation 2, Nintendo GameCube, Xbox, PSP, alongside with PC as well. That there was actually that particular level called Several Heights. Well, as it turns out, that particular name sounds a bit familiar. That's just mainly because that was before when My Little Pony Generation 5, specifically My Little Pony A New Generation, did somehow also use the name called Several Heights as one of those specific locations for Pegasus ponies, so, or Pegasi, depending on what specific thing you want to call it. So either way, I thought it was a little bit interesting to say the least, especially noticeable because I did not notice that at first, especially noticeable about the fact that, well, that was back in Journey Forms of at some point in July that I first discovered with the Forms of Several Heights. At first, in Journey Forms of Pac-Man World 3, well, as it turns out later on, that My Little Pony Generation 5 did somehow manage able to reuse that particular name of Several Heights and turning into a bit of a Pegasi home paradise kind of syndrome or something. So either way. So yeah, that's as far as I can say about the forms of today's topic at this point. Apart from that particular one thing that I suppose, surprisingly enough, that I forgot to mention about during the course of around 2 days ago, is that, did you guys believe about the fact it's been 5 years ago since when Joker is actually been available on Super Smash Bros. Ultimate as one of the first ever DLC character packs, which as a result, it's pretty crazy while looking back on it though, especially noticeable despite the fact that I'd never actually played as Joker as much, because for me, my mains with the forms of Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, which there are not only Banjo and Kazooie, as well as the forms of Sonic the Hedgehog, and even Sora as well. So generally speaking, I was about the fact that it's nice to look back on Journey forms of Joker's existence, and also came out to be released during around that time. So either way, okay, something's worth noting for is about the fact that this is going to be the final time to able to play as not only E123 Omega, but it's also with Rouge the Bat as well, and it's also the final time we did somehow collect as one of their keys. So thank goodness for that, because obviously that was about the fact that I've just seriously had enough collecting the majority of the keys of this run. Like, that is so many keys that we have to obtain throughout the majority of this run. Well, either way. And also, we realized that we might as well come across into this annoying mechanic ever since in Kingdom Valley, as well as Radical Train, that we have to build up our Chaos Energy, and in order to able to actually go through this laser gate, well, there is no way you can get rid of it. We have to able to pull up with this particular technique by simply clipping through this particular laser gate in order to able to progress. So, yeah, it's a bit finicky still though, especially noticeable because, like I said before, it does give you a lot of time wasting if you keep on getting a lot of trial and error for able to you know, flip for that particular laser gates in order to progress. So, but suffice to say though, let's talk about the forms of my true final thoughts of Sonic the Hedgehog 2006 before we able to actually finish up everything for the sake of the forms of, well, the entire Let's Play itself. Usually, relatively speaking, like I said before, this is seriously a bad game. It's not the worst game I ever played, though. Like, usually it's kind of a bad one. Like, there are some good aspects, though, which I'll explain more about that in a moment. Like, oh yeah, I suppose the final thing I want to mention about this though, this is going to be the final time we're going to be seeing the actual loading times on screen. Especially noticeable that despite the fact I still have to edit out a lot of loading screens, so just in case it won't be too much of a time waster. So generally speaking, the only time we only did see the loading screens on this entire run through are very hard mode, and that's what appears to be starting the level itself, rather than just going into the actual transition to the next section. So, but anyway, back into what I was saying about the forms of my true final thoughts of Sonic the Hedgehog 2006. As I said before, it's not the greatest game in the world. It certainly is a bad one. Like, there are some positives though. Like, as I said this before, I will say the soundtrack is really dang good. Like, so much to the point about the fact that I can always listen to some good music in the background. Specifically, Tropical Jungle, Kingdom Valley, Crisis City, Flame Core, alongside with the forms of White Acropolis, and there's a bunch of music selection I do seem to really enjoy in Sonic the Hedgehog 2006, without a doubt. And as far as graphics are concerned, they're passable. I mean, the level environments can be gorgeous at times, nothing comes across as dazzling to me. And every single character model is constructed pretty nicely, and it really holds up in journey forms of the early Xbox 360 title or an early PlayStation 3 title, well, except for human models, because the human models look out of place. And speaking of which though, the presentation in this game still looks pretty bad. Like, the lip syncing is pretty terrible, and the character animations are way too puppet-like, even a human characters like Elise. And let's just say the voice acting is one of the worst the series has ever produced. And relatively speaking, I was about the fact that when it comes to multiplayer though, there's nothing right to hum about, and you won't be missing much. Like, for instance, is about the fact that it certainly feels a lot better than in forms of Shadow's multiplayer, likely in Shadow the Hedgehog, but it still doesn't even compare to the forms of how it does it in Sonic Heroes, or especially Adventure 2 Battle, and especially noticeable with the forms of, well, you name the rest. Like, the biggest issue with multiplayer in this game is horribly unbalanced. Like, I've already mentioned about this before already, since in a majority of the forms have been very hard mode playthrough, so yeah, there's nothing else I can able to repeat that particular topic again. And on top of all that stuff though, when it comes to like playable characters in journey forms of this whole entire game, I will say I only enjoyed 2 playable characters, which there are both Sonic the Hedgehog as well as Blaze the Cat, because obviously that's the only character, or those 2 characters, I'm somewhat more accustomed to. I would say it applies with the forms of the other characters as well, but no matter what though, they are pretty much controlled horribly, and on top of that, the ground speed is pretty much horrendous. I'm looking at you, both Knuckles and Amy, because my god, your ground speed is pretty bad. For specifically Amy in some cases though, because I will say Amy is the worst playable character in the entire game, which is a shame honestly, because I would have liked able to let her get improved, which thankfully though in Sonic Frontiers, thanks to the forms of the Final Horizons DLC, that thankfully though she becomes a lot more funner to play as again. So, despite the fact that she doesn't use a hammer, so instead she actually used cards instead. I wonder where she gets the idea from, exactly. Well, I never know. And on top of all that stuff though is about the fact that when it comes to forms of the gameplay style or the gameplay in the entire game, well, it's okay for the most part. I mean, it's not the greatest thing in the world, but I will say the level design is actually well constructed to me, especially noticeable about the fact I feel like that Sonic's level design is actually pretty tight in my eyes. Like, I do really enjoy with the forms of Dusty Desert alongside with the forms of Radical Train, and on top of all that stuff though, when it comes to forms of other characters in general, like for instance with Shadow, it's alright, but it's just about the fact that the combat itself gets very old very fast, and there's gonna be a lot of repetition going on. And as far as Silver is concerned, despite the fact he was the coolest character to introduce back then in 2006, well, his gameplay is just basically feels a bit of a snail's pace kind of character to play as, and that's as far as I can really think about it. Now, in terms of the forms of story though, my god, the story is an absolute cluster mess, ranging from complicated time travel aspect, and on top of that, Sonic's story is just pretty pointless, and on top of that, the only thing we can able to learn about the forms of both Mephiles and Iblis, alongside with the forms of, you know, Princess Elise, alongside with Solaris, is told in Shadow and Silver story, which, I will admit though, Mephiles the Dark, it was a pretty interesting villain to say the least. Well, usually relatively speaking though, despite his plans, is a bit stupid, and as a result, no matter what though, yeah, that's as far as I can try to say about the forms of my final thoughts of Sonic the Hedgehog 2006. I mean, I may enjoy the level design, but as far as the story is concerned and the technical side of things, this game is a large mess. Like, I can honestly agree about the fact that this game is the absolute worst of 3D Sonic games to date, which it still pretty much holds up as to be, without doubt, is the worst Sonic games to be in 3D, which as a result, yeah, you get the idea for that point. And wowee, that's quite a lot of explanation that I somehow managed to be able to explain about this. And the final thing I want to point out, yes, technically speaking though, this is my second attempt for this recording session, by the way. Nothing to do with the capture footage or anything, it's just that my commentary feels a bit iffy on my first attempt, which thankfully on the second attempt though, it's thankfully a lot more of improvement. So, Anyways though folks, and aside from all that stuff though, as you can tell, we now ended up on the final section on very hard in Dusty Desert as Shadow, which means we have to deal with more enemies, and that's it basically. So either way, so yeah, that's as far as I can say about this at this point folks, and I hope you guys are able to enjoy this particular Let's Play, because my goodness, it was quite a very interesting experience, at least for my circumstances anyway, despite there are some flaws for sure, and honestly the loading times are honestly very atrocious as well. So generally speaking now, if I were you, you might able to recommend with the Xbox 360 version because of all that particular reduced loading times on a patch update, and on top of that, ignore the PlayStation 3 version at all costs because of the frame rate issues and you name the rest. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching about Let's Play of Sonic the Hedgehog 2006, and this is me, Maxi, here, from the likes of the Maxi Toys. So, until then, we'll stay tuned for some more redo Sonic Let's Plays. So, we're not exactly sure which one are we gonna do next, but you'll find out soon enough. So, I'll see you guys next time for that. Bye!